All right, Reddit, I never thought I'd be one of those guys spilling his life here, but life is a way of throwing curveballs that knock the air right out of you. I'm sitting in my office with the door locked, replaying every moment of the past few days, trying to figure out where it all started falling apart. So here's the setup. I'm William, 37. My wife, Linda, is 34, and we've been married for almost a decade. We have one son, Ethan, who just turned 11. He's everything to me, smart, funny kind. The kind of kid who makes me feel like I must have done at least one thing right in my life. Linda and I, though, we've had our ups and downs. Every marriage does, I guess. But until recently, I thought we were solid. Sure, Linda thrives on being the center of attention, and I'm the more reserved type. She's the life of the party. I'm the guy making sure the lights stay on. We've always balanced each other out. Or at least, that's what I told myself. Ethan's birthday party was supposed to be one of those perfect family moments. Linda went all out, reserved this fancy restaurant, invited a ton of people, and made sure everything was picture perfect. That's Linda for you. She thrives on grand gestures, making a show of things. Ethan deserves the best, she kept saying, and I couldn't argue with that. I mean, what dad doesn't want to give his kid a day to remember? The restaurant was packed. Kids were darting between tables, parents were laughing and trying to keep them in check, and Ethan was in the middle of it all, grinning ear to ear. It was chaos, but the good kind. For a while, I was able to just enjoy it. Watching my son with his friends, catching up with a few buddies I hadn't seen in a while, and sneaking bites of the cake Linda insisted be custom-made. But then I started noticing things. Little things. At first, it was just the way Linda was laughing. Not the usual polite chuckle she'd give to someone's corny dad joke, but that full, head-thrown-back kind of laugh. The kind I hadn't seen her give in a while. And it wasn't aimed at me, it was aimed at the waiter. A tall, broad-shouldered guy with one of those easygoing grins you'd see in a toothpaste commercial. I brushed it off at first. Linda's always been a bit of a flirt. It's part of her charm. People are drawn to her, and I've never been the jealous type. But this felt different. The way she leaned in when he spoke. The way her hand lingered a little too long on his arm when she laughed. I tried to ignore it. Ethan was having a great time, and that's what mattered. I didn't want to ruin his day by spiraling into paranoia. But as the night went on, it got harder to brush aside. It wasn't just Linda. It was the looks. A few of the other parents, like Claire, gave me these sideways glances. You know the kind. The "are you seeing this too?" kind of look that makes your stomach twist. I kept telling myself it was all in my head. I'm overthinking this, I thought. It's just a party, and Linda's being Linda. But then she started disappearing for long stretches. Just checking in with the staff or making sure everything's running smoothly. It felt off. It looked off. After the cake was cut and the kids started winding down, Linda pulled me aside and said she'd go thank the staff personally. I didn't think much of it at first. That's Linda, right? Always going the extra mile. But when 20 minutes passed and she still wasn't back, I started feeling that uncomfortable weight in my chest again. One of the dads, Greg, made a joke about how Linda must have found another bottle of wine to crack open. I laughed along, but it didn't feel funny. When Linda finally came back, she looked different. Her hair was smoothed down, and she had this overly casual air about her, like she was trying too hard to seem relaxed. She avoided my eyes when I asked where she'd been, brushing it off with some comment about chatting with the manager. We packed up the leftover cake and gift bags, loaded Ethan into the car, and drove home. He was out cold before we even hit the highway, his face still smeared with frosting. Linda leaned her head against the window, scrolling through her phone while I drove in silence. The house was quiet when we got back. Ethan was still asleep, so I carried him upstairs, tucking him into bed while Linda disappeared into the bathroom. I should have let it go. I should have chalked it up to me overthinking things and gotten some sleep. But something about the way Linda acted that night wouldn't let me. I couldn't shake this feeling that I'd missed something, some detail that everyone else at the party seemed to catch. That's when I saw her phone. It was sitting on her nightstand, screen lighting up with a notification. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe it was the look she gave me at the restaurant, or the way Claire had raised her eyebrows, or maybe I just had enough of second-guessing myself. Either way, I reached for the phone. So, life went on. That's the funny thing about suspicion. You think it'll gnaw at you until you crack, but in reality, it fades into the background. You file it away, convince yourself it's nothing, and focus on the bigger picture. That's what I did after Ethan's birthday. I had no hard proof, nothing concrete to hang on to, just a gut feeling I couldn't shake. But what was I supposed to do? Blow up my marriage over a hunch? Linda and I got back to our routines. We weren't the type to have a lot of drama in our marriage. Things were usually pretty steady. She's an elementary school teacher, works hard, loves her job, and I'm a criminalist, which means my days are packed with analyzing evidence and chasing down facts. It's not glamorous like on TV, but it's solid work, and I've always been proud of what I do. Money's tight for us, though. It's not like either of us is pulling in six figures. Between the mortgage, Ethan's activities, and just the cost of keeping the lights on, there's not much left for extras. That's why Linda's new girls' night started to raise a few flags. It wasn't unusual for Linda to go out with her friends. She's always been social, and I've always been fine with it. But it was the where that got me. It started about a month after Ethan's birthday. Linda mentioned that her group of teacher friends had found a great spot to hang out, a cozy little restaurant downtown. She talked it up, saying it was perfect for unwinding after a long week. The name of the restaurant? The same one where we'd had Ethan's party. That one stung a little, not gonna lie. It wasn't cheap, and Linda knew we couldn't afford to make it a regular thing. When I mentioned it, she brushed it off. It's just for special occasions, she said, smiling in that way that makes you feel like you're overreacting. The girls and I split the bill. It's not a big deal. So, I let it go. I mean, she deserved a break. Teaching's not easy, and God knows she's earned a glass of wine or two. But the visits became more frequent. At first, it was once every couple of weeks. Then it was every Friday. She'd come home late, smelling like perfume and wine, glowing from whatever conversations they'd had. She seemed happy, relaxed. But the more she went, the more uneasy I got. That feeling I'd pushed down after Ethan's birthday started creeping back. Especially when I realized she never invited me to join. Not even once. I'm not saying I expected a seat at girls' night, but an occasional dinner date there wouldn't have killed us, right? When I brought it up, she laughed and said, "It's a girls-only thing, William. You'd hate it anyway." That wasn't the only thing. She was dressing up more for these nights out. Nothing outrageous, but definitely more effort than usual. New earrings, a new dress here and there. I told myself it was just part of getting ready with her friends, but every time she walked out the door, I felt this pang of something I didn't want to name. Jealousy? Maybe. Doubt? Definitely. The tipping point came a few weeks ago. It was a quiet Saturday morning. I was sipping coffee and flipping through case notes at the kitchen table while Linda scrolled through her phone. She casually mentioned that the restaurant's waiter, the same one from Ethan's party, was such a sweetheart because he always made sure their table got the best service. I froze. I hadn't heard her mention him since that night. And now here he was, being casually dropped in a conversation like he was an old friend. "You know him that well?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. "Oh, he's just friendly," she said, waving me off. "He's good at his job, that's all. You'd like him." Would I? I didn't press further. I didn't want to seem paranoid. But the way she said it like it was the most normal thing in the world stuck with me. That night, I stayed up late, replaying the pieces of this puzzle in my head. It felt like there was something I was missing, something right in front of me that I couldn't quite put together. Over the next few weeks, I started paying more attention. Not snooping, at least not yet, but noticing. Linda's phone was practically glued to her hand. She'd smile at texts she wouldn't share and turn the screen away if I walked by. When I asked about her nights out, her answers were light, breezy, always the same. We just talked about school stuff. Nothing exciting. But she seemed too careful, too rehearsed. And I couldn't help but notice that the glow she came home with didn't seem entirely about her friends. I told myself I was imagining it. Again. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. Something about this didn't add up. And if there's one thing my job has taught me, it's that when something doesn't add up, you dig until you find the truth. I'm not there yet, but I think I'm getting closer. The pieces are starting to come together, and I don't like the picture they're forming. A few nights ago, I got stuck working late. It happens often in my line of work. Being a criminalist means long hours, late nights, and enough paperwork to bury a small country. I told Linda I wouldn't be home until late, and she assured me everything was fine. When I called to check in around dinner time, Linda mentioned the nanny was coming over. That struck me as odd. We've used a nanny occasionally, but only for special occasions. Anniversaries, work functions, or when we both had something unavoidable. Why would she need a sitter if she was staying home with Ethan? The thought nagged at me, but I dismissed it. Maybe she needed a break. Or maybe she just wanted to catch up on errands without dragging Ethan along. It wasn't until later that I realized there was more to the story. Over the weekend, I was helping Ethan with his school project. It was one of those crafty assignments where foam spheres became planets, and half the glue ended up on the table. We were laughing about his interpretation of Jupiter when he suddenly mentioned something that made me freeze. Ethan casually brought up that someone had come to the house while I was gone. A man. My first reaction was disbelief. Why would Linda have someone over when I wasn't home? But Ethan described the man as tall, with dark hair, and mentioned he looked familiar. My stomach churned as he added that Linda had gotten dressed up before leaving with him, saying they were going somewhere beautiful. Somewhere beautiful. The words lingered in my mind like a bitter aftertaste. Ethan didn't seem to think anything was strange about it. He'd been left with the nanny, and that was all that mattered to him. But for me, it was like someone had flipped a switch. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The image of the waiter from Ethan's birthday came back in a sharp focus. It had to be him. Ethan recognized him, and the description matched. This wasn't just coincidence. It was deliberate. Linda hadn't mentioned going anywhere that night, let alone with someone else. The thought of her getting dressed up, leaving Ethan at home, and going out with another man made my blood run cold. I spent the rest of the evening trying to act normal, even as my mind raced. I didn't say anything to Ethan. I didn't want to drag him into this or make him feel like he'd done something wrong by mentioning it. But inside, I was unraveling. All the little moments I'd brushed aside, the late nights, the glowing after her outings, the increased trips to that restaurant. They all came crashing down like dominoes. After Ethan went to bed, I sat in the living room, replaying everything in my mind. Linda was nearby, scrolling through her phone, completely at ease. She had no idea what I'd learned. I thought about confronting her right then and there, but I stopped myself. Without solid proof, she'd deny it, twist it, make me feel like I was overreacting. I needed more than suspicion and Ethan's innocent observation. For now, I stayed quiet. But the storm brewing inside me was impossible to ignore. Linda was keeping secrets, and now even Ethan had noticed things I'd tried to ignore. This wasn't just in my head anymore. Something was happening right under my nose, and I couldn't pretend otherwise. I've always believed in facing the truth head-on. My work demands it, and I've carried that mindset into every part of my life. But this is different. This is personal. And if Linda thinks she can keep hiding, she's wrong. It's only a matter of time before the truth comes out. I don't know what my next step is, but I know one thing for sure. I need answers. The weight of suspicion had been pressing on me for weeks. Each day, adding another piece to a puzzle I never wanted to solve. Linda's late nights, her glowing smiles after her outings, and Ethan's casual mention of a man picking her up. Everything was pointing to something I couldn't ignore anymore. I decided I needed to act. I needed to stop waiting for the truth to land in my lap and start looking for it. That's why, last Friday, I decided to surprise Linda by picking her up from work. It wasn't something I usually did. Our routines were well established. She'd finish her day at the elementary school, I'd wrap up my shift as a criminalist, and we'd meet at home. But I had a free evening and a gnawing curiosity I couldn't shake. It seemed like a good way to bridge the growing gap between us, and maybe, just maybe, put my doubts to rest. Her school day ended around 4 p.m., so I left work early and drove to the modest brick building where she taught. The parking lot was nearly empty when I arrived. I parked, leaned back in my seat, and watched the doors. I expected to see Linda walk out with her usual tote bag slung over her shoulder, wearing one of her practical outfits, the kind she always joked about being teacher chic. Instead, I saw nothing. After 10 minutes, I started to wonder if I'd missed her. Maybe she'd left early, thinking she'd beat traffic. But something didn't sit right. I got out of the car and walked into the school, where the lights were already being turned off in the main hallway. A few teachers were chatting near the front office, and one of them, a colleague I vaguely recognized, spotted me and waved. "Hi, William," she said, smiling warmly. "Did you forget something?" I shook my head. "I'm just here to pick up Linda." She didn't mention needing a ride, but I thought I'd surprise her. The smile on her face faltered slightly, replaced by a hint of confusion. Oh, Linda left a while ago. I think it was just before 3. I felt my chest tighten. She left early? Her colleague nodded. Yes, she said she had plans. She looked amazing, by the way. That dress, wow. I thought she was heading to some fancy dinner or event. I assumed you two were going somewhere special. I forced a smile and nodded, even as my mind raced. Thanks. I must have gotten my wires crossed. She gave me a sympathetic smile before heading toward the parking lot, leaving me standing there with a sinking feeling in my gut. Linda hadn't mentioned anything about leaving early, and she certainly hadn't said anything about dressing up. If she was going somewhere special, why hadn't she told me? I walked back to the car, my heart pounding. My thoughts were spinning in 100 directions, each one worse than the last. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a last-minute work dinner or an impromptu meet-up with her friends. But no matter how I framed it, the pieces didn't fit. She wouldn't need to hide something like that. Not unless there was a reason to hide it. The drive home felt endless. I kept checking my phone, half expecting a message from Linda explaining her plans, but there was nothing. When I finally pulled into the driveway, her car wasn't there. The house was quiet, eerily so, and it made the weight in my chest feel even heavier. I sat at the kitchen table for what felt like hours, staring at my phone, debating whether to call her. If I did, what would I even say? If she was lying to me, she'd have an excuse ready. And if she wasn't well, I'd look like a paranoid husband. I kept telling myself to wait, to see how she explained her absence when she came home. Linda finally walked through the door just after 8 p.m., her heels clicking against the floor as she set down her purse. She looked immaculate. Her hair perfectly styled, makeup flawless. And yes, she was still wearing that beautiful dress. The sight of her, glowing and confident, made my stomach churn. I hope you didn't have to work too late, she said casually, smiling at me as if nothing was amiss. I nodded, forcing a neutral expression. It was fine. She breezed past me, heading upstairs to change, leaving the faint scent of perfume in her wake. She didn't offer an explanation for her outfit, her whereabouts, or why she hadn't told me she'd left work early. And I didn't ask. Not yet. As I sat in the quiet kitchen, the pieces of this puzzle started falling into place. Her colleagues thought she was going somewhere special with me. Ethan had seen a man picking her up. The late nights at the restaurant. It was all leading to one conclusion. A conclusion I wasn't ready to face, but could no longer ignore. I don't know where Linda went that night, but I know it wasn't work. And whoever she's keeping these secrets for, it sure as hell isn't me. This is getting harder to ignore, and I'm running out of ways to convince myself it's all in my head. I need to figure out what's really going on. The truth had been unraveling for weeks, piece by piece, until it was impossible to ignore. Linda wasn't just keeping secrets. She was living a double life, and I couldn't let it slide any longer. Ethan deserved better, and so did I. It was time to take control of the situation, and that meant preparing for the inevitable divorce. The first step was to gather evidence, and as a criminalist, I leaned on the skills I knew best. Every detail mattered. I went through phone records, credit card statements, and social media activity. Linda had been careless, leaving behind a digital trail of her deception. The frequent charges at the downtown restaurant, the late-night babysitting expenses, the recurring visits to locations she'd never mentioned. All of it painted a damning picture. I began documenting her patterns in a journal. The nights she came home late, the times she dressed up for vague errands, and the moments she seemed glued to her phone, smiling at messages she'd never share. I kept everything factual, avoiding assumptions. This was about building a case to ensure Ethan stayed with me. One evening, I noticed her car wasn't in the driveway when I arrived home earlier than expected. She hadn't mentioned going out, and when I checked with one of her colleagues later, they confirmed she'd left work hours earlier in a dress that looked ready for a red carpet. My heart sank. She wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. Despite everything, I didn't confront her immediately. I knew Linda. She'd twist things, turn the blame onto me, and deny what was staring us both in the face. Instead, I focused on preparing for the divorce. I contacted a lawyer, ensuring I understood the process and my rights, especially when it came to Ethan. My lawyer emphasized that the most critical factor would be proving I was the more stable, present parent. That was easy. I had been Ethan's anchor throughout all of this. I made sure his routine stayed consistent, that his homework got done, and that he always felt loved and secure, even as my own world was falling apart. Meanwhile, Linda's priorities seemed elsewhere. When I finally told her I wanted a divorce, she didn't take it well. At first, she acted shocked, as though she couldn't understand why I would want to end things. Then came the anger. She accused me of overreacting, of invading her privacy, and of trying to control her. But I didn't need her admission. The evidence was undeniable. She knew it, and deep down, I think she knew this moment had been coming for a long time. The divorce proceedings were tense. Linda fought hard, but the truth was on my side. I documented everything. The financial inconsistencies, her frequent absences, and her unwillingness to prioritize Ethan. In court, I presented a clear picture of who had been the constant presence in our son's life. Linda, by contrast, struggled to justify her choices. In the end, the judge granted me primary custody of Ethan. Linda retained visitation rights, but even those seemed to fall by the wayside as time went on. She was consumed by her own choices, leaving little room for anything else. At first, Ethan asked about her often, and I did my best to answer his questions honestly without bitterness. But as the months passed, her calls and visits became less frequent, and eventually, they stopped altogether. Life after the divorce was a mix of relief and rebuilding. Ethan and I found a new rhythm, one that didn't include Linda's unpredictable chaos. The house felt emptier without her, but it also felt lighter. For the first time in a long time, there was peace. Looking back, the entire experience was a painful lesson in trust, resilience, and priorities. If there's one thing I learned, it's to listen to your gut. When something feels off, it usually is. Don't ignore the signs, and don't let anyone make you feel crazy for asking questions. More importantly, I learned the value of focusing on what truly matters. For me, that was Ethan. He deserved a parent who put him first, who showed him what stability, honesty, and love look like. And if there's one piece of advice I'd give to anyone in a similar situation, it's this: don't lose sight of yourself. It's easy to let betrayal define you, but you're more than someone else's mistakes. You can rebuild. You can find peace. And in time, you'll look back and realize that walking away was the bravest thing you could have done. Ethan and I are doing well now. Life isn't perfect, but it's real. And for the first time in years, that's enough.